Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Broke Up, Not Broken. If you're going through a divorce, don't worry, you're not alone. This is your one-stop shop for mastering your life and your finances throughout the entire divorce process. Today, we're thrilled to have Eric Brotman with us. Eric is the CEO of BFG Financial Advisors and the author of the award-winning book, Don't Retire, Graduate. He and his team believe that financial literacy is the key to financial freedom, so they provide free and affordable education resources and accessible financial planning with no asset minimums. I definitely want to talk about this because we are on the same page here with that. If you're feeling overwhelmed by your divorce or your current situation in life, don't be. Eric is here to help us break it down so you can feel confident and prepared by creating a clearer picture of not only your financial situation, but how you can tackle the personal challenges along the way that you might be facing. So grab yourself a cup of coffee or your beverage of choice, buckle up, and let's once again get you personally and financially empowered. Eric, so awesome to have you with us today.
Jamie, it's great to be here. And in terms of favorite beverage, based on this topic, I think it should probably be Scotch, single malt, preferably.
Absolutely.
This isn't a coffee conversation.
No. So if you're listening to this, you don't want to do that while you're driving, but when you get home or back to the office or whatever, open up that drawer and keep listening. So this is going to be a great conversation because we're on the same wavelength here, right? I'm a certified financial planner, as are you, and the work I've been doing that work for almost 20 years now, when you've been doing it a very long time as well. So I've over the last couple of years, I've shifted more of my focus on divorce financial planning. So I think, again, we're on the same wavelength here. So maybe give me a little bit of background on your experience and some of the experiences you've had relative to divorce, and we can kick it off from there.
Well, just in general, first and foremost, I have been doing this for 31 years, which is hard to believe, and started a company, BFG Financial Advisors, 21 years ago. As a startup and bootstrapped and borrowed money from everywhere. And now we're a company with a national presence, which is wonderful. In terms of divorce, I certainly have plenty of experience with it. Not only was I divorced on my 28th birthday, which we can talk about, but we've also seen it impact clients and loved ones. And, I was a product of divorced parents as a 12-year-old, so I wear that hat as well. And, a divorce is a little bit like a death in the family that keeps happening. And, when somebody dies, you grieve and you move on in various ways. And certainly some cases are much, much more difficult than others, depending on circumstance. But with divorce, especially if you're divorced with children, it's like you get to relive that on an ongoing basis. It's extremely emotional. And even the best divorces can be really tough.
Absolutely. And we must be twins separated at birth because
well,
my parents were divorced when I was relatively young as well. And that's really what propelled me into the world of finance, because I saw the stress and strain that it created for the family. And, God bless my parents for working as hard as they did to get us through it. My dad was working 2 jobs. My mom worked multiple jobs. And really, they were also very young when they got divorced. They were married and then they subsequently got divorced. So they kind of were fighting an uphill battle, from the very beginning. But man, it's super tough. So what are some of because this is awesome because this is a financial planning focused type of conversation and also a show and all the work that we do. So
sure.
Let's talk a little bit about from a comprehensive financial planning perspective, what are some of the things that people need to be thinking as they start preparing for divorce? I of course have my own tips and tricks and things that I think of. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Well, whether you're doing business planning or personal planning, the time to plan for divorce is while everybody's happy and doing great. So you plan for it long before it occurs, not because you're rooting for it, but because you're trying to insure against the worst. So in the same way that you buy car insurance, not hoping to have an accident so you can try it out, there are things that you can do. And particularly if you've been married before, for a young couple who have no material assets and are just getting started, it's not really as big a deal. But for people who are remarrying or getting married later in life, or maybe starting over and have kids from multiple marriages, a prenuptial agreement is not romantic, but it is darn important. And coming up with a way to make this palatable in the event it doesn't work, to me, it's not a sign of bad faith. It's not a sign of, it doesn't create, I think, bad juju. People worry that, planning for that means you're not all in. And the time to put the lifeboat on the Titanic is before it sets sail. That's not because you're hoping to sink. It's because stuff happens. And when it happens, you want to be able to both sort of swim to safety in that regard. And so I think the time to start planning for divorce is long before you get married. And I don't mean like the week before you get married, hey, let's sign this, because that's not enforceable. There's all kinds of legal stuff around that. I mean, when you're starting to talk about combining finances, which is what people who get married or get engaged do. You're suddenly talking about joint accounts and different beneficiaries and different responsible parties in your legal documents. And so when you're coming together and you're starting a union like that, that is where you're making some pretty big decisions that are harder and harder to undo as you get further along. And so having a sort of break glass in event of emergency box to me is not, I don't think that's bad luck. I think that's good planning.
Yeah. So you're kind of alluding to the whole concept of a prenup, right?
Well, it can be. It can be a prenup, or it can even be a postnup if you're already married, although that's a much harder conversation. There's nothing less romantic than a prenup. Let's call it what it is. But for people who've been married before, there tends to be an understanding that, hey, I've been divorced before. I know how painful that is, and I know how expensive it is. And let's make sure that we don't put ourselves through that torture that we've already been through. For people who've never been through it before, they really don't know just how expensive and just how challenging it can be, especially if there's acrimony. And so the time to plan, yes, a prenup makes a lot of sense for a lot of people, either because one person has kids from a prior marriage or because one person owns a business or has material assets and the other doesn't. When people inherit money from family, that's typically safeguarded from divorce in most jurisdictions, unless you make the account joint. If you've made it joint, it becomes marital. And so a very simple stroke of a pen can mess that up. And so having the right financial advisors, the right legal advisors, the right tax advisors makes sense along the way. And while you're planning to get married, people spend more time picking out their cocktail napkins than they do figuring out their financials, which is bizarre to me. Although I do still have some of the napkins from my second marriage, which was 17 years ago. Napkins are in good shape. But people spend more time on those things than they do on their own financials, much in the same way I've heard people spend more time planning their vacation than their retirement, which is bizarre.
Totally bizarre. And I would concur. I mean, that's the main problem with society today. And frankly, it's just for the lack of education, right? They don't teach you this stuff in school. And it's up to people like us to educate and continue to share the information, as much information as we can. I feel like that's like the scarlet letter we carry along with ourselves, is really just to educate and educate and educate. Because I did just see here in the state of California that one of the requirements is to take a financial course before you.
I actually read that. Yeah.
I think that's going to start next year, which is amazing. It was one of the only amazing things California has done in the last couple of decades. But
fair.
That's a podcast and a totally different story.
That also requires a single malt. Yes, understood.
Exactly. Yeah. Many of them. But you touched on probably like 5 or 6 things in those last comments that I had questions on. So I'm gonna kind of bounce around a little bit as far as questions, because it's all really good stuff. Let's talk about asset division, right? That's one of the things that comes up all the time. Maryland, where you are, community property state, equitable property state. What does that look like where you are?
Maryland, it's funny. It depends who you ask. Legally, Maryland is not a community property state. It's a state where marital assets are often divided relatively down the middle, but it depends on some other factors. If you ask most divorced breadwinners, I'm not going to say husbands because it could be either side of the coin. If you ask the breadwinner who's been divorced, you will get the sense that the divorce always favors the non-breadwinner. And there is a sense of that around alimony. And alimony and child support get confused a lot. Child support is something that you'd be paying anyway if your child was living with you. I think there's a different level of begrudging around paying for your children's welfare than it is paying for a potential non-working or less working spouse to not have to push that envelope. And there's baggage around it. But in Maryland, generally, if it's joint, if it's been acquired during the marriage, and if it's not inherited, it's going to get split in one way or another.
Are there any tips and tricks around that? Because at least here in California, there's also the component, a quasi community property, right? If you move assets that were a single name, and then you materialistically change the way that they're being used, or way that if you're generating income off a particular asset, so on and so forth. Sometimes what it used to be single name property or individually owned separate property can become what's called quasi community property here in the state of California and in some other states as well. So any thoughts around that?
What we see in a lot of prenups is we see the harshest level of prenup is title governs.
Mm.
So a title governs prenup says if it's an individual name, it belongs to that person, period, no matter how it got funded, no matter where it came from. If it's in that person's name, it's that person's account. The problem with that is that if you have one working spouse and one non-working spouse, or one high income spouse and one modest income spouse, they're going to have different size accounts, particularly retirement accounts. One of them's maxing a 401k for 30 years and one of them's not. Maybe they're funding an IRA, but it's dwarfed. And so if you allow title to govern during an extended marriage, that really is harmful to the less working spouse. But title governance is not something I see in a lot of prenups. Most of the time, what I see is almost a compromise up front. Like we're going to come up with not an allowance, because that's sort of an uncomfortable idea, but we're going to come up with a division of certain property and make sure that we're both okay. That's really what it's about. It's, I love you enough to marry you. I will make sure you're okay, even if we're no longer in love someday. And while I can't possibly fathom that that's possible, it does happen. So let's be prepared for the possibility that for whatever reason, we're no longer feeling what we're feeling right now. And let's make sure we're both okay. We've taken care of each other this far. We're going to take care of each other for the rest of our lives, one way or another, even if we're not married.
Yeah. And dividing up assets also brings up another problem, taxes.
Oh, yeah.
What are some of the things you've talked to your clients about? What are the things that some of our listeners need to understand relative to taxes and dividing up these assets?
People need to understand that a dollar is not a dollar. And what I mean by that is different kinds of accounts have different levels of spendability on them. A dollar in a traditional 401k or IRA hasn't been taxed yet. So that dollar is a dollar with a mortgage, whereas a dollar sitting in a savings account is a full dollar. There is no tax liability on that. So you don't just split it down the middle and say, all right, you get X dollars and I get X dollars. They have to be X dollars net of whatever tax burden is waiting for them. And that could be capital gain. You could have mutual funds that you all bought as a married couple that have a $200,000 gain in them. You have to allocate not only the shares, but also the basis of those shares. And that requires some accounting. Normally, if an account's being split down the middle, the basis would be half and half, which is a very fair way to do it. But if you decide to do it another way, what you don't want to be is the spouse who allows the other party to dictate which assets go to you and which assets go to him or her. Because if there's a $500,000 account and $300,000 of it has no gain and $200,000 of it has a gain, it's tripled. You want to make sure that it's not just, hey, you get 250 and I get 250. It's not the same, because there is no step up in basis at divorce. In other words, if you retitle that asset into one name, the basis remains the same. The tax liability upon sale remains the same. So a dollar is not, in fact, a dollar. It's a dollar less capital gains. And the same thing's true with IRA assets. There are other types of things. People look at an estate and they look at death benefits, for example, on life insurance. And a lot of times that's included in a taxable estate. Well, you can't consider the death benefit of life insurance one of the assets when you're calculating a split. That's not to say life insurance isn't used in divorce. It's used a lot of times in divorce, especially if there's kids, where you have to maintain a certain amount of life insurance for your spouse or former spouse for some period of time. That's incredibly common. And sometimes that's an existing policy. Sometimes it requires new underwriting if you can do it. But you can't count the death benefit as part of what one party is getting or the other party is getting. It's a totally separate thing. It's not here now. You can't use it to pay the mortgage.
Yeah. As far as the insurance goes, what you're talking about is putting protections in place to not only to cover the like support payments, things of that nature. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. Or the offset of a pension. If you're a state employee and you have a pension plan, but it doesn't kick in until you're 65 and you die when you're 53, there is no pension and there's no survivorship on that pension. There might be a small death benefit, but there's no income forever. If you take that income at 65, now you can set it up with joint and survivor benefits for married people, or you can set it up under what's called a quadro, which is a domestic relations order, which allows some portion of that pension to go to your former spouse. But it won't exist if you die before you elect your pension. And so if you're counting on your ex-husband or ex-wife who has a pension to make sure that some of that's coming your way, you have to have enough life insurance to offset that, at least until they flip the switch and retire and start the pension income, where it may not be there.
Yeah, it's an awesome tip. So for those of you that are listening, that you want to rewind and listen to that again, because every case we work on, one of the last things we do before we let anybody sign off on anything is to ensure that there are clauses in the documents related to the insurance to cover support and things like the pension, because if you pass away before, that stream of income kicks in, in some cases, that's going to cause a major issue, and you could derail the entire financial plan that we've put together for you. So that's awesome tip there. We're in that same vein. Let's talk about estate planning. It's one thing that I'm super passionate about as a certified financial planner, and the work I do in that wealth management realm, make sure all of our clients have estate plans in place and so on. So maybe just give us a brief snapshot so that for the listeners that don't really understand what that involves, what that looks like, and then how beneficial it can be, and some of the things you want to consider relative divorce in that area.
Well, general estate planning for most families or most couples is 4 documents for each adult spouse in most cases. You have a will, and people sort of intrinsically know what a will is, or instinctively know it's a document to divide your stuff if you die. But there's much more in a will than that. It names guardians for your children if you have minor children. It names trustees to take care of money you're leaving to a 7-year-old who isn't prepared to manage that naturally. There are other roles in terms of who's responsible for what in the will. So it's more than just where does my stuff go. In addition, there's a durable financial power of attorney. The power of attorney allows someone to step into your shoes and handle financial matters for you. For married couples, a lot of times you allow your spouse to do that immediately. And there's lots of reasons why that's a great thing when you're married. And of course, it's revocable. So if you're getting divorced, one of the things you want to let your attorney know is to invalidate the power of attorney document so that you don't accidentally have an estranged spouse go drain your account, which legally they could if you don't take that step. So that's a big change for divorce, is to nullify the financial power of attorney. The other 2 documents, one is a living will and one is an advanced medical directive. And some attorneys combine them into sort of Part A and Part B, and some do separate. But at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're stating your wishes in the event you're in a vegetative state or something terrible's happened to you. You're naming your wishes, and then you're also naming the person who can speak to a physician on your behalf. That, at divorce, you might say, you know what, my ex-wife is still the best person to talk to about that, and that's up to you. Or you might say, I'm naming a sibling. You can redo those documents whenever you want to. When you have a will and you're alive and well, the will does nothing until you die. The power of attorney and health directive are only active while you're living. So those are documents that if you were to pass away, they become invalid anyway. When you're looking at divorce, a lot of times there's a separation agreement, and a lot of times that's then followed by a divorce decree. That becomes part of your legal, which I would argue is part of your estate plan as well. Whether it's considered an estate planning document by definition or not, I think is immaterial, but it is part of your legal world at that point. And you're going to have to potentially either make an amendment to your will, which is called a codicil in most places, where you amend the will to accept the language in the divorce decree. Like we talked about, the will might say, we're leaving certain property to this person up through the age of majority for our son, for example, after which that's a non-issue. So those things will happen. And upon divorce, you are going to want to look at doing new estate planning at some level. The first thing to do, though, is to invalidate the financial power. You don't want your former spouse, in your bank account. You really don't.
And that's the same for retirement account, beneficiary status, and things of that nature,
Well,
right?
beneficiary status is a little different, because once you are not legally married, you do not have to have a spouse as a beneficiary. Under a 401k or most qualified plans, if you are married, your spouse must be your primary beneficiary unless he or she signs off that it's okay not to be in front of a notary. That is true of a 401k, a 403b, certain other types of plans. It's not true with an IRA. So if you have an IRA, you can name anyone you want, and so can your spouse. I think doing a beneficiary designation inventory is a wise thing to do anyway. People should do that tomorrow. Well, that should happen anyway, because there's so many mistakes. We see people who don't have a beneficiary named. We see people who named their firstborn child, but they've had 2 more children and they never updated it. And at some point, that's an issue. So I think reviewing your beneficiary designations, reviewing your asset titling. There are lots of different kinds of joint property. Some are community property. Some are, in Louisiana, they have a totally different set of rules for property. In other places, it's just different forms of tenancy. Joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Tenants in the entireties is allowed in some states and not in others. Tenants in common, which is separate interests. And I don't want to get off on legalese, so I apologize on the tangent, but Just because both names are on a statement does not mean it's equitably and totally owned by both parties. There are lots of different ways to title assets jointly. If you own a home together, you're going to want a new deed for that home, deciding on who's receiving it, unless you're both going to own it until it's sold. In some divorces, the title doesn't change. Maybe the mortgage doesn't even change. It's being paid under the divorce decree by one or both parties in certain percentages, but you may not have to retitle the house. It might not be settled until the house is sold 18 years later. I mean, that is a reasonable thing in certain cases. It depends how ugly the divorce is. Is it acrimonious, like you can't wait to trip this person in traffic? Or is it, you know what, we fell out of love, it happens, but let's not hurt each other. And I don't know about you, Jamie, I know you're a mediator. I don't know if you do collaborative divorce.
We do.
But collaborative divorce, in my opinion, is the single best way. Mm-hmm. If there is such a thing as a good way to get divorced, collaborative divorce allows everyone to be at the table without confrontation, without having it be me versus you. It can be us figuring this out. And a mediator who can do collaborative divorce can help everybody not hate each other, at least not as much at the end of the day. It's a major deal, because if you're both hiring attorneys and if you're constantly fighting over the scraps of what's happening here and there, the only person who's making out there is the lawyer. Mm-hmm. They make a fortune. The uglier the divorce is, the more money the lawyers make, the less money is being split by both spouses. So to find a way to not spend $100,000 fighting with each other puts $50,000 in each of your pockets, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. And I'm a firm advocate for that. And that's why I do the mediation work. That's why I do the work that I do, because mm-hmm. my divorce, unfortunately, still carries on even to this day. It's never going away, especially we're $75,000 into a divorce that I finalized 7 years ago. It's total nonsense. It's not, it shouldn't be that way. And it's not by my own doing, that's for sure. But it just is what it is. And if we can try to help people avoid that, and like you said, remove the confrontation, go get this through either mediation or a collaborative process. We're actually gonna do a whole show on collaborative divorce here coming up soon, which listeners should make bookmark and follow and like and all that other stuff, so they can get updates on that. But more to come on that. But I'm a firm believer in that. And because you're absolutely right. If you have spent $100,000 on attorneys, and to your point, that could have been $50,000 in your pocket, $50 in the other party's pocket.
Yeah,
that's a huge impact on not only your current financial situation, because life after divorce is going to be completely different, especially at least at the outset, right? Like, you can rebuild and you can grow in your career and so on and so forth. But day one of your newfound single life, your financial situation is totally different than it was the day before. And the year before, right? So let's talk about. I'm kind of alluding to this, but the kids, right? Like, what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about relative to the kids? I know one is the estate planning, so we maybe want to come back to that. But college planning, future financial planning. Let's talk about the impact of the kids.
Before we talk about any of that, Jamie, we have to think about the impact that divorce has on children to begin with, psychologically, mentally, emotionally, because the damage that's done to kids when their parents split does not mean that parents don't sometimes split for the right reasons. There are plenty of reasons why it's still better for everybody in the end. But no matter how amenable everyone is, this is a death in the family for the kids and a completely different life. I was 12 when it happened to me. You had mentioned that it happened to you in a similar age, and it does change the landscape. And so the first thing that I think both spouses need to do is do everything in your power not to pit the kids against each other or against the other spouse, not to share adult dirty laundry with teenagers. That's not helpful, or even grown, adult children, and to put their needs at least on par, if not first, so that they don't have to witness this. They don't have to go through the adult experience that the adults are having. So let's start there.
Yeah, 100%.
In terms of the logistics, you have to figure out a lot of things. You have to figure out where the kids are going to live. How old are they? Is there a daycare scenario? Are there benefit scenarios? Are there public school scenarios? Are you in different districts? You have to agree in the divorce decree who's going to handle, for example, the payment for college, because in some states, 18 is the age of majority, and a parent can say, hey, you're on your own, we're doing nothing. In other states, it's 21. In a divorce decree, you might say, I'm going to continue to support, or we're going to pay some percentage of education up to X dollars or for X number of years, Maybe it's 70-30, not 50-50, but that's how we're going to handle it. If there are 529 plans or other college savings plans, often they'll be referenced in a divorce decree in terms of which ones will be used first. They don't necessarily have to be retitled initially, but it might be required that your former spouse becomes the successor owner of that plan, for example, so that if I drop dead and I have a minor child, that child doesn't inherit that 529, but my former spouse does for that child's benefit. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to leave the money directly to kids, because all it's going to do is mess up their financial aid profoundly. You don't want the kids to ever own their own account. Custodial accounts, if you have any shot at financial aid, do not have accounts in the kids' names, period. Have accounts for their benefit, have accounts earmarked for them, have accounts where they're beneficiaries, but for Pete's sake, don't put money in their name, because every dollar in their name is a dollar less financial aid. You're literally saving their future college money. So there's that. In terms of other sort of tips around assets and around, you mentioned the estate planning. Yes, you're going to make some changes to that. But some of this is also about custody. I mean, for Pete's sake, I don't know anyone who says, I want to be a Wednesday and every other weekend dad. Like, what a tragedy that is. And to fight over that and to be like, no, I want Thanksgiving, you can't have Thanksgiving, destroys it. And someday these kids are going to grow up and they're going to potentially get married and start their own families and have kids. And how many birthday parties do you have to have if you can't get along to show up at your 3-year-old grandson's birthday party? Like, shame on you at some point.
Yeah.
So a lot of the divorce stuff is financial, but so much of it is emotional and relational. And somehow in the back of your mind, while you're angry at this person, for whatever reason, whether he or she did something wrong or whether it just didn't work, while you're angry at this person, somehow you have to muster the courage and conviction to say, I used to feel differently about this person, and this is not the way that me would have treated her or him. That's hard to do.
Yeah.
It's emotional. It's hard to do. But if you can do it, and if you can mediate, and if you can be collaborative, and if you can not ruin every holiday for the rest of time, then you're not putting your kids in a position where they have to choose. I'll tell you a story, Jamie. When my folks divorced, this is a God's honest truth. It was the summer after 6th grade. And it's one of those moments you remember. You remember where you were on 9/11. You remember where you were when the space shuttle blew up. You remember certain moments in life. People remember where they were when they heard about John F. Kennedy. The day I found out my parents were divorced, I remember where I was sitting. I remember everything about that instant, and it's been 40 years. And I remember my father in his infinite wisdom approaching us and saying, your mother and I are getting divorced. Who do you want to live with? I said, I can't make that up. And my 12-year-old self, and I had a younger brother, still have a younger brother, my younger self had the gumption to say, are you selling the house? He said, no. I said, well, then we'll stay here. You guys figure out who's staying with us. So help me. That was my 6th grade self.
Wow.
I didn't want to be separated from my brother. I didn't want to give up my neighborhood, my friends, my anything if I didn't have to, and let them worry about it.
Yeah.
I literally threw it back at him. Like, what do you mean? Who do we want to live with? Well, what are the parameters? And that was, it's so important to message this to the kids appropriately so that they don't feel like it's their fault, which, by the way, they're going to think it's their fault anyway. They are. They're going to say, oh, what did I do? Or how could I have done this differently? Or I wish I hadn't given them a hard time at dinner last Tuesday. Like, it's not about that. It's never about that. But kids can't process. They don't know what's going on behind closed doors. They don't know what went on before they were born even. So it's an incredibly difficult thing, but messaging it right matters, and figuring out the living situation matters. I never, and my mom stayed with us. My brother and I stayed with my mom for a number of years. And then, 4 years or so later, she moved out and my father moved back in. We never moved. We literally never moved. They swapped. She moved out. He moved back in. We had time with each parent one-on-one for a period of years. And that was that. And functionally, it was fine. It was strange, but it was fine. Everybody made out okay. And that was the best way I know of to do this. Some people talk about nesting. You're familiar with the nesting concept, this idea that you keep the house and the kids stay there, and sometimes dad's there and sometimes mom's there. And then mom and dad each have another residence to go to where the kids don't have to feel like, oh, I'm in dad's apartment right now, which nobody wants to go to, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody wants to go to their dad's apartment. They got their friends, their bedrooms, their stuff, their routine, everything. So they nest. And now you're paying for 3 residences instead of 2. 2 is bad enough. Imagine everything doubling. Imagine now you have 2 electric bills and 2 this bill and 2 that bill, and things aren't pooled anymore.
Yeah.
It doubles certain expenses. Divorce is so unbelievably expensive. And that's before you've paid the lawyers and fought with each other.
Yeah. That's where the value of financial planning comes in. Right. And that's why I think you and I and a lot of really good, advisors out there do the work that we do, because we recognize the real value in this. Unfortunately, the work that we do is very intangible, right? I mean, I guess you can print up a 100-page financial plan and somebody can actually hold it in their hands, but 9 times out of 10, it just sits there and collects dust on a shelf somewhere. Yeah. So we don't even do that anymore. It's all everything's digital. But
right,
you're absolutely right. This is where the rubber meets the road for the work and the work that we do, and proves that, like you said, there's 2 of everything now. All your expenses are now doubled, and that money that used to be thrown in the center of the pot, so to speak, and into the pot, and everybody, you pay the bills, and then whatever's left over, you get to save or spend or whatever. That's all changed. That's all changed. So, the work that we do as CDFAs is, obviously focusing on, the here and now and how to make really good decisions through the divorce, so you're not jamming yourself up moving forward. But that's where, working with someone like you and someone like myself moving forward, people can really benefit, because once the dust is settled on the divorce, you've got to figure out the rest of your life, and it impacts the kids and so many decisions you're going to have to make along the way. But hey, man, this conversation has been amazing. I think anybody that's listening to it should put this thing on repeat, because you had so many nuggets of just knowledge and amazing tips and things to consider and so on. So I'm super appreciative of it. Carte blanche. I know you have this book that you wrote. It's a bestseller. Anything you want to share relating to the book? Any final words of wisdom that you have to share? Blank check.
Wow, blank check. I do like those. First, shameless plug. This is the book, Don't Retire, Graduate, available on Amazon or any place you buy books. There's also a workbook with it, which for folks who either aren't ready for a financial advisor or don't know if they want to pay a financial advisor, it will create a financial plan for you. You can go through some exercises. I don't believe in homework. I don't know about you, but as a kid, I didn't like homework, but I always did extra credit. So every chapter has an extra credit assignment. And if you do them all, you will have a financial plan, and it will involve your accountant, and it will involve your attorney, and it will involve debt reduction and banking and insurance and all these different things. But you will literally have built your own financial plan very, very easily and very inexpensively. And then you can decide when it's time to also get some professional advice, because frankly, folks like Jamie, folks like myself and our teams and our firms, we really are accountability partners. And we really do. It's kind of like having a trainer at the gym. We all know how to do push-ups, but if somebody isn't saying drop and give me 20, I don't know about you, but I might not. Yeah. If I have an appointment with my trainer, I go. And if I don't, I got 50 things I'd rather do than work out. It's just true. So the accountability of it becomes helpful. So for more about our white papers and our podcast episodes and all of the media, including some free online courses, folks can go to brotmanmedia.com and see a whole library of information. Most of it's free. And I hope it helps a bunch of people.
Yeah, man. Thanks so much for sharing that. I mean, it's great to see that other advisors are trying to do good work and share as much free information, as much information as possible to help people along the way. So I'm super appreciative of it. Don't worry, if you're driving, if you're listening and you can't jot this information down, all this information is going to be in the show notes. So, we're just, follow, like, subscribe, do whatever you have to do to make sure you stay tuned and get access to more information. And as more episodes come out with amazing guests like this, you're in the know. So thanks again, man. I appreciate your time today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.